The negative aspects are widely known downsides of being a highly sensitive person or an empath, like overthinking, absorbing other people's emotions, people pleasing, startling easily, etc., actually have less to do with the actual trait of sensitivity itself, and much more to do with things like toxic relationships, unsupportive environments, chronic stress, trauma, poor childhood conditioning, etc. Hi, I'm Tiara Ariel. And before I get into any of this video, I want to say that I'm not a scientist, doctor, or therapist. I'm just a highly sensitive person and a wellness coach who is extremely analytical and has been obsessively educating herself on psychological concepts over the past several years, trying to understand herself and her trait and heal. And I want to potentially save you, the viewer, likely another highly sensitive person, a lot of time and pain, and just pose an idea of what I've come to believe strongly is a very sound theory as to why us HSPs across the board struggle with so many of the same things, and how it seems like on the surface that it's our sensitivity that is to blame, when in reality, it's actually a reflection of how our sensitivity has become maladaptive, to no fault of our own, really. In fact, it's actually quite brilliant what our subconscious mind and our nervous systems do to protect and sustain us. So many of us want to rid ourselves of our sensitivity, which we can't do because it's in our DNA. But that's okay, because getting rid of our sensitivity is not actually what we need to do anyway. We don't need to change the fact that we are sensitive. We just need to heal the ways that our sensitivity has adapted to deal with stress. Okay, I know you might be like, Tiara, what the hell are you talking about? So let me just get into the explanation. Normally, I'd like to make this a very pretty video, as cinematography and video editing are passions of mine. But for the sake of not having a great deal of time or energy right now, as many of us don't seem to have, and the fact that I've just been wanting to get this message out to the sensitive community for a while now, I'm just going to make this a very straightforward Google Slides type of video. Alright, here we go. Well, let's not just do a white background. That's boring. Here, I'll toss up one of my nature images. Ah, that's better. Alright, let's make it a little bit lighter so I can write stuff on it and you can see it. There we go. And I'll make sure to stay up in the top corner here so you don't feel like I completely went away. Okay, so I'm going to plop in all of the widely known and frequently mentioned drawbacks or negatives that are commonly understood as things that just come with the trait. These are gathered from my own experience and self-study, and from what hundreds of other HSPs have said on the internet, including a submission form that I invited all my Instagram followers to submit their responses to. So here we go. Absorbing other people's emotions. People-pleasing tendency. Taking things too personally. Beating ourselves up. Overthinking. Startling easily. Chronic overwhelm. Can't let things go. Tired all the time. Emotional roller coaster. Often overstimulated. Struggling to set boundaries. Perfectionism. Insecurities and low self-worth. Low tolerance of violence or injustice. Well, that's just a good thing to not have a tolerance for, right? Personally, I think none of us, sensitive or not, should be able to stomach injustice or violence, in my opinion. Anxiety and depression, preoccupied with analyzing social cues and expressions, feeling isolated and misunderstood, struggling with decision making. See, there's so many, I don't even have room on the slide, I'm just having to cram them all in here. And restlessness to fill up this last little bit of room here. I know many of you have struggled with a lot of these, especially if you found this video. What's fascinating to me, though, is that the more I've learned about the HSP trait, psychology, healing, etc., the more firm I get in my own theory that none of these things that you see on the screen here are actually inherent to the HSP trait and are just reflections of how the HSP trait has been stressed and turned into survival adaptations and coping mechanisms as a result of experiencing chronic stress, unhealthy and toxic relationships and environments, subconsciously absorbing poor messages from childhood, traumatic experiences, etc. Okay, so if these aren't true and inherent aspects of the HSP trait, let's get clear on what actually is. Okay, so we know that what makes an HSP is that we have a more sensitive nervous system and a brain that prioritizes thoroughly processing our experiences, thoughts, and ideas and pays extra special close attention to social emotional cues. As a result of these things, the true inherent aspects of the highly sensitive trait are keen awareness of subtleties in our surroundings, depth of processing of all incoming information, placing higher cognitive priority on noticing and having an acute awareness of social cues like facial expressions, having a high degree of empathy or capacity for empathy, and caring deeply for others. Emotional depth and responsiveness, conscientiousness, attunement to the people and things in our environment, and heightened interoception, essentially internal awareness or noticing of bodily sensations. That's it, truthfully. These are the only core, born with them aspects of being highly sensitive. These are the true things that quote unquote come with the trait. Notice that none of the things on this list are inherently bad or negative. In fact, they are all very fundamentally neutral. If anything, some of them seem actually very positive. And it kind of just looks like a list of unique skill sets, doesn't it? So how do these things actually become bad then? Each one of these things, when taxed or stressed, challenged or taken advantage of, can morph into a survival adaptation. We end up leaning on these things so heavily to stay safe or loved or whatever it is that they become coping mechanisms when taken to the extreme. So now let's go through each one of these so I can give you an example to really make it easy to conceptualize. And just so you know, before we get into this, fair warning for these examples, I am just hypothetically painting a picture of a possible scenario that may or may not ring true for you. And the ways in which these adaptations can manifest are certainly not limited to the examples that I'm posing. There are plenty of possible origins for how our brains and nervous system's natural abilities can become warped as a way that we adapt to protect ourselves. But I just want to give you a little disclaimer that I'm using hypothetical specifics in my examples so that I can illustrate the point clearly. And I want to apologize if any of the scenarios that I've chosen to highlight my point end up being triggering for you. They are meant to be eye-opening and validating and may spark some much-needed light bulbs in your head that could possibly also feel emotionally charged, depending on which of these you resonate with. So with that said, let's get into it. So let's start with keen awareness. Keen awareness of subtleties in our surroundings when stressed, challenged, or taken advantage of, essentially leaned into to utilize as a survival strategy, can become an overactive startle response, jumping at loud things, etc., or more broadly, hypervigilance, routinely and continuously scanning our environment for threats. One example of this could be if you grew up in a home where someone's angry footsteps entering the house, a door being slammed, etc., frequently preceded a yelling match. Your sensitivity may have tried to protect you by using your nervous system's ability to be hyper-aware as a way to catch potential threats as soon as they could be detected. Essentially, your survival mechanisms lean into your nervous system's sensitivity to be able to detect even the slightest changes in your surroundings. You are not hypervigilant and jumpy just because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your nervous system to get stuck in a perpetually guarded state. When you are in consistently safe environments and your nervous system is calm and regulated on a more regular basis, your inclination towards being keenly aware of your surroundings can become something incredibly positive, like a deep connection to the present moment and stronger intuition. You can be an HSP and not be constantly on edge. Okay, now let's talk about depth of processing. Deeply processing all the incoming information in our lives and all the internal thoughts and feelings and ideas we have. When stressed, challenged, or taken advantage of, essentially leaned into and turned into a survival strategy, can become overthinking and overanalyzing, and can seep into anxiety, an obsession with problem solving and understanding things, and even a dissociation from the body, living primarily in the mind. One example of this could be if you had recurring experiences where mind games were played on you. You were left alone to solve problems, or people's words didn't match their actions. Your sensitivity may have tried to protect you by leaning into your brain's processing power, to outsmart someone, or to analyze and be able to predict or understand something. You are not consistently and regularly anxious, overthinking, and overanalyzing simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your brain to feel like it needed to be on overdrive, calculating and predicting things to keep you safe. When our brain feels like it has the ability to safely take downtime and creative ideas can flow naturally and not out of a desperation to solve something or stay ahead of the curve, our inclination towards deeply processing ideas and possibilities can become something incredibly positive, like innovation, creativity, cleverness, insightfulness, and a healthy balance between being in the body and in the mind, and honoring the power of the mind as equally as important as the body. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not be stuck in detrimental thought loops all the time. Acute awareness of and attentiveness to social cues can become anxious preoccupation with reading into people's facial expressions as a predictive, protective mechanism. One example of how this can happen is if you had repeated experiences where others around you weren't great communicators, and you learned that it benefited you to read people's emotions, to gauge how they felt about you, and anticipate what they do or want next. Your sensitivity may have seen this as a way to help you remain safe or loved, so it leaned heavily into your brain's ability to note and decode this type of information. You are not anxiously preoccupied with all the social, emotional information you receive each day simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your brain to focus heavily on facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, etc. Because it deemed from your past experiences that this type of information was crucial data of the utmost importance to use to protect your well-being. When there is clear, open, and respectful communication in our relationships from both sides, our nervous system feels more at ease in our interactions, and our inclination towards being attentive to social cues can actually become something incredibly positive, like being a really good listener, while feeling grounded and remaining secure within ourselves. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not stress about everyone else's moods or what they are thinking all the time. Okay, having a high degree of or capacity for empathy and caring deeply for others can become self-deprioritization, meaning you keep pushing yourself farther and farther down on your own priority list, self-abandonment, where you completely cast aside your own feelings and needs for the feelings and needs of others, often without even realizing it, and people-pleasing, where you overly accommodate others and are preoccupied with others' perceptions of you, and having poor boundaries in general, where you don't set standards and guidelines around what you will and will not put up with. One example of how this can become a survival strategy is if you had recurring experiences where you were told your needs are too much, or you only received love when you were good or when others were happy. Your sensitivity may have tried to protect you by using its high degree of empathy to prioritize everyone else's needs and feelings, likely in the attempt to remain connected, safe, and loved. You are not a chronic people pleaser and struggle to set boundaries or put yourself higher up on your own priority list simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your high degree of empathy to focus heavily on and prioritize everyone else's needs to maintain love or safety, and abandon the self for the sake of maintaining everyone else's well-being. When we reserve empathy for ourselves and we put just as much importance in our own needs and feelings as we do others, our inclination towards being highly empathetic can become something incredibly positive, like beautifully balancing being there for ourselves and being there for others. You can, in fact, be an HSP and feel empathy for other people and not lose yourself or cause detriment to yourself in the process. Okay, the next one up is emotional depth and responsiveness. This, when stressed or taxed, can become extreme emotional ups and downs, like a roller coaster that is not regulated. And if this ride goes on too long, it can even become depression when the strategy eventually becomes not to feel anything at all, because feeling is too much or not accepted, or there is no safe way to process feelings. So we intelligently deduce that it's better to depress and suppress all of our feelings. For example, this can happen if you were left alone with your feelings often, or were never taught emotional regulation skills, or were shamed for your feelings or told they were too much. Your sensitivity may have felt so unbelievably unsupported that you'd flail anytime you felt a big emotion or resolved to suppress your emotions altogether. You are not experiencing an emotional roller coaster in life simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your emotions to run haywire with no way to healthfully process them and regulate your own internal state back to homeostasis. When we have ways to process our own emotions and safe containers in which to do so, our inclination towards being deeply emotional can become something incredibly positive, like deeply enjoying and experiencing life, and having a great deal of emotional intelligence and fluency and nuanced regulation skills. You can be an HSP and not feel tossed around and dictated by fluctuating emotional states. Conscientiousness, which is just a fancy term for self-awareness, when taken to the extreme, can become blaming ourselves by default and being highly self-critical and beating ourselves up. One example of how this can happen is if you had recurring experiences where you were criticized, blamed, not given the benefit of the doubt, or had people around you who refused to take accountability. Your sensitivity may have tried to protect you by leaning into its tendency to self-reflect and preemptively assumed responsibility. Find the flaw in yourself before someone else does and resolve it, most likely in an attempt to maintain love or connection. You are not highly self-critical and have an inner bully that will not let up or let things go simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your brain to think it was more beneficial for you to develop a skill to just be able to call yourself out. Your default view of yourself becomes negative, and you become encouraged to internalize problems and absorb fault. When you have healthy, accepting, encouraging, and forgiving relationships with others and with yourself, and feel secure in your own fundamental worthiness, our inclination towards being conscientious can become something incredibly positive, like increased self-awareness of our positive traits and skills and self-compassion. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not feel like you're constantly beating yourself up all the time. A heightened interoception, which essentially means internal awareness, when taken to the extreme can become anxiety about bodily sensations, hypochondria, or even dissociation. An example of how this can happen is if you've had experiences where you felt a physical sensation or something that you or even doctors could not explain, which over time began to feel like an internal threat. Your sensitivity tried to protect you by ramping up your awareness to these messages so that you would continue to pay attention to them until they were properly addressed. You are not experiencing strange symptoms or anxiety about those mysterious symptoms simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your nervous system and body stress, so that they try and speak to you in different subtle ways. And since you haven't always known how to decode these messages, it has become a source of stress and anxiety. When we know our body well and we know how to take care of it and are properly able to recognize, manage, and even eliminate our stressors so they don't pile up and become symptoms, our inclination towards heightened interoception can actually become something incredibly positive, like having a clear communication pathway to what our bodies need and being able to follow through on the behalf of our own well-being. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not have symptom anxiety. High environmental attunement, when stress, taxed, pushed to the extreme, can become chronic overstimulation and overwhelm. Definitely what has not helped this is this achievement-focused, modern-day, insane expectations of multitasking and the bombardments of information that our brains, highly sensitive or not, have simply not evolved fast enough to be able to process, not evolved nearly at the same rate as technology and society. Nor, in my opinion, should we be aiming to or wanting to evolve at this rate and be superhuman robots to be able to accommodate all the information we're inundated with nowadays. We are natural creatures meant to be roaming the earth at a reasonable pace, connecting to each other and the natural environment. An example of how high environmental attunement can become chronic overstimulation and overwhelm is if you've had too many demands at work or at home, a very busy schedule, unresolved stress in your body or in your environment, or an overly taxed nervous system. Your sensitivity might struggle to cope with stressors that keep piling on that are not being resolved. So your ability to process all that you're aware of and your tolerance levels begin to diminish. You are not overwhelmed on a regular basis, no matter what is going on in your life, simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your nervous system to get overloaded and burnt out, and likely hasn't had the proper tools, environments, and relationship adjustments to fully recover and maintain stability going forward. When your nervous system has the tools and skills and ability to frequently and reliably find its way back to regulation, our inclination towards being highly attuned to our environment can become something incredibly positive, like a profound connection to our natural surroundings. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not feel constantly drained and exhausted by life. And finally, high relational attunement, when taken to the extreme, can become absorbing others' emotions. This one is kind of a combination of empathy, attention to social cues, and attunement to our surroundings rolled into one. This is that notorious avenue from which we develop that emotional sponge quality, where we regularly feel like we are absorbing and taking on other people's emotions. One example of how this can happen is if you are frequently around those who could not regulate their own emotions, blamed you for their emotions, or the caregivers that were supposed to be taking care of you frequently required you to provide them with support or accommodation. Your sensitivity may have tried to adapt by attuning to others' emotional states, taking on a fixer role, and may even have felt fulfilled by the idea of taking away others' pain. These are the types of relationships where you may have learned that it was highly beneficial for you to abandon your own needs and feelings and focus more on others. This is also where codependency can develop in the attempt to try to heal others, by thinking that if we could somehow take on their emotions for them, that they'd feel them less themselves. You can also place higher importance and weight on the feelings of others if you were told, like many of us were, that you are too sensitive. This teaches us not to look to our own emotions for guidance, but instead to the feelings of others to know how to feel, which can cause us to overly focus on and identify with them. You are not absorbing and taking on the emotions of others simply because you are sensitive. It's because your sensitivity was subjected to something unhealthy, unsupportive, stressful, or traumatic that caused your heart to feel deeply responsible for and compelled to absorb and take away others' feelings as a way to make it all right in your world again. This causes you to leave your own grounded center within yourself and overly identify with others' emotions, thoughts, ideas, opinions, etc. When you have a strong emotional attunement to yourself and your own needs and are in relationships with others who also know how to tend to and take responsibility for their own emotions, our inclination towards being highly attuned to those around us can become something incredibly positive, like being a great friend who can provide a safe and supportive container for others to process their own feelings. This is a lot healthier of a way to relate to others. You can, in fact, be an HSP and not take on and feel responsible for other people's emotions and personal journeys. Okay, so that goes over the main list of things that we talked about at the beginning of this video. But I want to mention a few other things that are often considered to be just being a part of being highly sensitive that actually aren't necessary to experience just because you're an HSP. Things like feeling isolated and misunderstood all the time. This can come from things like chronic invalidation or alienation, from relationships and experiences where you were told you are too sensitive, your feelings were too much, off, dismissed, etc. Feeling excluded as part of a minority group. Any minority group can feel this way at times, but no matter who you are or where you come from, there's always going to be people out there who are inclusive and can relate to you, or are at least willing to put in the effort to understand your experiences, and people who also won't get it, who don't care to get it and can't relate. If you found yourself in supportive relationships and environments, perhaps with other HSPs and even non-HSPs who can relate to you in some way, you wouldn't feel as isolated and misunderstood all the time. And in the occasional case when maybe you do, you can always validate yourself. You are not bound to be isolated or misunderstood just because you are sensitive. A lot of HSPs also struggle with decision making. This one could be filed under depth of processing, but again, it's not the tendency towards thinking deeply and careful consideration alone that causes a struggle with decision making. It's when those tendencies are negatively influenced to the point where you lose confidence in your ability to make the right choice that you begin to struggle with making decisions. This often boils down to a lack of trust in oneself and a fear of failure or making the wrong choice, which can stem from things like being undermined, criticized, or micromanaged often, or told that you're doing things wrong, being shamed for making mistakes and now having a fear of doing so, being told that you're too sensitive and now you don't trust that your own internal sensors are accurate enough to gauge anything from, including your decisions. When your immediate surroundings include affirming and encouraging relationships and environments, including the relationship you have with yourself and your own internal environment, that promote you to have trust and confidence in yourself, you would feel more secure in your own decision making. Another thing that a lot of HSPs struggle with is perfectionism. This one is similar to the last one. Perfectionism is essentially an intolerance for making mistakes, fearing ramifications of making a mistake, or having any sort of flaw for someone to notice and use against you. Sometimes perfectionism can be a way that we try to feel in control, or even self-sabotage, to not let ourselves progress further because for some reason, Progress feels scary, so we obsess over something until it's perfect, even though it will never be. This can also deep down stem from self-worth issues, as a result of being criticized or rejected for flaws or mistakes. This can stem from being shamed for making mistakes, being compared to siblings or other peers, only receiving praise when you're achieving, and then learning to tie your worth in your accomplishments because someone else viewed your worth through your level of accomplishments. When you are in relationships and environments that celebrate effort over outcome, it becomes more natural to not strive towards perfectionism, but simply doing your best and knowing that that is enough. A lot of HSPs talk about taking things too personally. This could be filed under emotional depth and high relational attunement. It's that lack of focus on what we feel about ourselves and lack of recognition of a person's words and actions being about that person and not about you. I believe this comes from a fear of people's perceptions of us, a lack of strong sense of self, and a low sense of self-worth, thinking that anything that another person says or does somehow influences our own worth, assuming that everything is a reflection of you instead of a reflection of that person, and basically putting your worth and how you feel about yourself in another person's hands. Yes, we should care about what our loved ones and those that we admire and respect think about us to some extent. It is natural and healthy for us to care about their feelings and experience of us. But these things shouldn't have the ability to quickly dismantle how we fundamentally feel about ourselves. Taking things too personally can stem from being in relationships with people who have been discouraging or invalidating, or just haven't truly seen you for who you are. Being frequently rejected by people who didn't see your value or showed no patience with you, which has made you anticipate rejection or being seen in a bad light. People who have made you feel unseen or made you feel responsible for their emotions, or have defaulted to blaming you for things. When you are in relationships that are mutually accountable, where everyone has a defined sense of self and their inner self-view is primarily grounded in their own views of themselves, it is much more natural to have a positive self-worth and self-perception that is not easily dictated by passing comments or opinions, or even feedback or grievances. Criticism is then much easier to take as it is viewed as an area to grow within, and not a personal attack that damages your core self-image. I have found that many HSPs struggle with an inability to rest or do self-care without feeling guilty or uncomfortable. This can stem from things like low self-worth or fears about things slipping away if you aren't pushing and trying hard, or not trusting others to do things as well as you can, feeling like other people always need or depend on you, etc. It's possible, if you struggle to relax without guilt, that you got messages that your worth is tied to your productivity or achievements. You were told that taking care of yourself is somehow lazy or selfish, when in reality, it's completely necessary. Maybe you were yelled at or scolded when you were relaxing and felt shamed because of it. Maybe you were just never taught or modeled the importance of rest, so the whole idea of it feels foreign to you. Or maybe it's possible that you've had your accommodating nature taken advantage of or valued so much that now you feel like everybody relies on you and you can't take a break. When you are in relationships and environments that encourage you to take care of yourself, where it feels safe to rest and beneficial to rest, you don't feel feelings of guilt and are able to truly relax and benefit from taking downtime. You don't feel guilty for taking time to take care of yourself simply because you are sensitive. Again, it's because you experienced something that made you feel like taking care of yourself was somehow not okay or completely valid and necessary. And the last one that I want to talk about, which is another common experience for the HSP, is feeling like you're tired all the time. And while someone with a sensitive nervous system may be more likely to tire out easily, having a sensitive nervous system alone does not cause fatigue. Many other things can cause fatigue, like draining relationships and chaotic and toxic environments, physical health issues, unprocessed emotions, and plenty of other things. So please don't ever assume that your fatigue is just part of the trait or considered normal or just in your head, even if a doctor tells you that you're probably fine. Trust yourself. If your brain or your nervous system or your body is overworked, then fatigue is expected. This is true whether you are highly sensitive or not. Being more sensitive may mean that you are more susceptible to fatigue, but that's only if your systems are not being properly supported. If and when they are, there's no reason you should expect to be tired all the time. When you are in relationships and environments that do not chronically tax you, and you're able to participate in activities that are fueling, and you have proper support for your nervous system, your brain, your physical, emotional, and mental health, it's much more normal for you to only feel tired after a long day of activities as a healthy human body should. Not simply because you're just trying to get through day-to-day life as a sensitive person. So if you look at this list of what we've just discussed and recall what we went over earlier, I bet you can also see how there is a decent amount of overlap in all of these things too. For example, being told we're too sensitive on its own can cause issues by conditioning us to distrust our own senses and look to others for answers, and therefore struggle with decision making. It can make us feel insecure and lower our self-worth, and therefore affect our desire and feeling worthy enough to set boundaries in the first place. It can make us abandon our feelings and attune too much to others to gauge how we should feel. Being told you're too sensitive can make you feel like you're taking something too personally every single time you feel upset by what someone has said or done, even if your feelings are in fact completely valid. Being told we are too sensitive can make our emotional experiences even more up and down, because now not only are we feeling an emotion, but our experience of feeling that emotion is being denied and dismissed as well, and all that does is amplify it more. It can cause us to beat ourselves up because now we've grown to understand from the feedback from those around us that there is something somehow inherently wrong with us, and that we must figure out how to get rid of it, which can make us spend a great deal of time analyzing ourselves and our emotions, trying to sort out in our minds and overthink about whether we should be feeling a certain way or not. Being told you're too sensitive can also contribute to and exacerbate feelings of anxiety and depression. And you better believe that being told you're too sensitive can make us feel massively misunderstood and isolated from those around us. So, I want to challenge you next time someone says that something negative about the trait just comes with it, to look deeper at it and ask yourself if there isn't a mind, body, or heart wound there from stressful experiences or poor messaging, something that could actually be shifted and healed, and may not at all be just because you have a sensitive nervous system. Chances are, if this thing is something that could theoretically stem from a negative aspect of an unsupportive environment or relationship that you spend a good deal of time in, then it's very likely that it isn't something that you're experiencing just because you're an HSP. I truly believe that none of these things are a part of your experience solely because you're a highly sensitive person, and if resolved, can be dissipated or lessened in your experience, all while still being the same level of sensitive that you are. And that doesn't have to change for these experiences to change and improve. And it's not that HSPs are the only ones to be affected by these types of things or develop these particular coping mechanisms. It's just that we are more likely to be affected and affected more deeply, simply because as HSPs, our nervous systems are more sensitive, which makes us naturally more affected by what's going around us, good or bad. So it's not that a non-HSP can't become a people pleaser or struggle with self-worth or decision making. It's just that we as HSPs are much more susceptible to absorbing these messages as the environmental and relational sponges that we are. As a very basic example, if two kids, one HSP and one non-HSP, in the same household grew up in the same crappy environment, but one of them was seemingly much more affected by things than the other, it's likely that the one that was more affected was the more sensitive one. But just as a reminder here as well, this also works in the opposite case. If both an HSP and a non-HSP were brought up in wildly supportive and encouraging environments, since the HSP is more likely to soak this up, they're more likely to flourish because of this. So I hope that by this point in the video, I have successfully proved my theory to you that none of the negative things that you are experiencing as an HSP are truthfully because you're an HSP, but are due to stressful experiences, unsupportive messaging, and maladaptive patterns you've collected from not ideal relationships and environments, and are things that can be shifted and healed. And of course, I'll reiterate here that I'm not a scientist or a licensed therapist, but this just makes a heck of a lot of sense to me as an HSP myself, and as a trained wellness and mindset coach. And if there are in fact any licensed psychotherapists or HSP researchers watching this video that want to confirm or deny or correct anything I've said, please feel free to do so in the comments. So if you're on board with my theory and you can now see how these things about life as an HSP very likely are not actually inherent aspects of the trait itself, but are the results of crappy experiences you've had to endure, and how your trait geniusly used the skill sets it already had to expertly adapt. And you now feel strongly that these are not experiences that you are destined to live with simply because you are sensitive, and that there is then hope that these things can actually be addressed and healed. The next logical question is, how do you do that? How do you live life as an HSP and not have to be dealing with all of these negative manifestations of these previous stressors and conditioning? Well, I know you're probably hoping that I'm going to tell you that there's a secret overnight technique, cure-all solution, but there isn't. This stuff likely took several years to deeply ingrain in your brain and your nervous system. And as with all healing work, this will take time and effort. But the incredible news is that all of these things can change and improve. You heal these things by doing the inner work, understanding your childhood conditioning, educating yourself on the highly sensitive trait, holistic wellness practices, healthy relationship dynamics, etc. I've been on this healing journey myself and can attest to the importance of each one of these things that I've just mentioned. I've been learning about the HSP trait since 2017, got certified as a wellness coach in 2018, and from 2020 through 2022, built an online course with everything I've learned about the trait, holistic wellness, and how to thrive and improve our well-being as HSPs. I now currently have people in the course as it stands finished, but as I've been discovering and collecting more and more of the final pieces of the puzzle, I continue to add them to the program. All of what I've mentioned here that you need to know about is currently in my program or being added to as you watch this. So here's your to-do list. Learn about the highly sensitive trait. Learn about how to take care of yourself as an HSP individual. That includes nervous system regulation and general wellness practices for your mind and body. Healing unhealthy patterns and conditioning that affect how you show up in relationships and how you view yourself and move through the world. Getting in touch with your intuition, your own feelings and needs, and your own dreams. And building that confidence and gaining clarity enough to pursue them. Addressing unresolved stress or trauma in the body and mind, keeping you stuck in these old patterns. And healing your self-worth and your relationship to yourself. It's a lot of stuff, but it's very doable and very effective and rewarding. All of this is included in a step-by-step journey so that you don't have to find this information elsewhere or use your brain at all to research and obtain the right information. You just log on and complete the next module. No time or energy wasted on anything that won't actually help you. My program includes all of the information you need, tools and guidance to implement what you learn, and support from me and the group. What it does not include at the moment, however, is any sort of trauma therapy, which is something I'd like to have in there, but I'm not licensed to do so and haven't partnered with anyone to include that yet. Hopefully someday. But that is definitely something you can acquire. Just like you'd also benefit from having an integrative doctor to help you navigate your physical health journey as well. The great thing about being a part of this program is that it sets you on the right track, so that you know exactly what steps to take, how to form a full support system around yourself, and take all the guesswork out of it. You gain access to me and other HSPs on the same journey, as well as all the pieces of the puzzle of thriving as an HSP that I'm consistently adding to the course. I've also recently began to learn more about complex post-traumatic stress disorder and have been noticing a lot of overlap between the stress responses in an HSP and this post-traumatic condition. If this sounds interesting or relevant to you and you want to learn more, let me know in the comments if you'd like me to make this the topic of my next video. If you found this video helpful, please share this with another HSP who you feel like can relate to these stress responses and give them the same eye-opening epiphanies that you've just received. I really do hope that the more stressed, overwhelmed HSPs out there gain access to this information and have these insights and epiphanies, the more likely it is to have a ripple effect of healing across the sensitive collective.